Welcome to another We're Not Done Yet conversation. I'm Elizabeth Macdonald, and with me is retired United Church minister Leslie King. For many of us, retirement provides an opportunity to return to an unfinished project. Leslie, you've wrapped up a project that you began more than 30 years ago. But before we talk about the specific project, let's set the context. It's 1986. The 31st General Council of the United Church of Canada has issued its first apology to Indigenous peoples, and you are called to your second ministry with Indigenous peoples to Swan Lake, Manitoba. You had been serving in the Grand River Six Nations area. So what was it like, Leslie, moving from one region of the country to another region to work with a different group of Indigenous people? What was that like?
It was very good. I almost felt like I was coming home.
Hmm.
However, the Anishinaabe, the Saulteaux of Swan Lake, are not the Haudenosaunee of Six Nations. And in the interview prior to having the call extended, I conflate's the wrong word. I made some assumptions about pan-Indianness, which is not a reality. And the interviewers made very clear that they were different from the Haudenosaunee. And that was good. That was good.
I think that's an assumption a lot of us settlers make. We often speak of Indigenous people in the singular,
Yes,
and don't always realize the diversity and the uniqueness across Indigenous nations.
there are 300 different Indigenous languages in Canada, and I think I'm accurate about that, but it's close to 300 anyway, and many, many, many different cultural practices.
Yeah. Now, it didn't take long for those leaders at Swan Lake to approach you and to ask you to take on a very special project. Can you tell us about that project? What was involved?
Well, it was about 1993. And I was asked by Chief Roy McKinney, who has since passed away, and the band council at the time to write a history of the involvement of the church with the Swan Lake First Nation. And the band council gave me some support. They gave me some financial support for travel. They involved me in a number of conferences that I would not normally have been involved in, which gave a lot of background. And of course, there was access to their archives and support staff if I needed it.
Now, this was some time before discussion about church involvement with Indigenous peoples was talked about very broadly. What moved you to take this project on, and what do you think prepared you to do this work?
I was moved because of a number of things. First, it was very important. 40% of my work at this outreach ministry was with the wider church, specifically with presbytery, to help build bridges. And the lack of information that people had was extensive. I've always enjoyed research. My background is in anthropology, specifically archaeology. And I always want to know why and what's behind things, what's the origin of stuff. Plus, when I was at Six Nations, and first as a student, and then I was settled there. I was there for 3 years, so 4 altogether. The 3 congregations I served, Chapel of the Delaware, Grand River United, and then New Credit United on the New Credit Reserve, which is adjoining. They took it upon themselves to teach me, to train me. They wanted to have a student minister, specifically to help train ministers. And so they took my education in hand and started sharing stories, not in any great detail, nothing like I heard through the alternative dispute resolution process in the 2000s. But, one woman, very distressed, said, I was taken to the Mush Hole, the residential school in Brantford, as a 4-year-old. And they didn't teach me anything, but I had to stand on a chair and wash dishes in the kitchen. Who would do that to a 4-year-old? I was stopped by a man who had a Sunday school connection with the United Church. I stopped on the street. He said, "Can I ask you a question?" And with this very child, and he was a salesman, right? So he was confident and he was brass, and but his whole demeanor changed to something very childlike, and his voice became a child's bewildered voice. And he said, "Why did you Christians do this to us?" And it just hit me in the stomach and set the course for the rest of my ministry. I had to find the answer.
So you found yourself at Swan Lake, the leadership asking you to find some of those answers in terms of their community's experience with the church.
Yeah.
What was it like uncovering information? And were you sharing it with Swan Lake folk right away, or was the process for you to compile the information and wait until you made a report? What did you do with that information you began?
I'm laughing because it was 25 years between the start of the thing and the end of it. So no, I didn't wait. There were bits and pieces that I shared to gather reaction. And there was a preliminary report, and now when I read it, it was really bad.
Oh.
But what was it like? I suppose there are two answers to that question. At Six Nations and New Credit, when people told me stories, it was in a pastoral care setting. And the stories were little, emotionally big, but not in great detail, and not for extensive periods of time. So, the layers of information built gradually. But that was started in 1979, and our awareness of the long-term consequences of abuse, the embedded nature of colonialism and colonial thought was still embedded. Nobody saw it particularly. So it was very gradual, and people slowly taught me. And then when I got to Swan Lake in 86, right away or pretty soon after that, we're into the Meech Lake Accord debate. And then in 1990, Oka, and so the atmosphere started to change. A piece that I just put together today, I learn, but I'm slow sometimes. Alexander Morris was one of the founders of Confederation for Canada.
All right. Yeah.
He was a significant leader within the Presbyterian Church of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba. Not the one who drafted Treaty Number 1, but the next one who modified it, confirmed parts of it, and messed up other parts of it. So Alexander Morris was father of Confederation.
Mm-hmm.
In 1990, Elijah Harper stood up in the Manitoba legislature holding a feather and an eagle feather and voted against the Meech Lake Accord, which killed it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, what a collision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, the Confederation, the eventual establishment of the Indian Act by another leading Presbyterian, David Laird, who drafted it, had also been Lieutenant Governor in Manitoba, Minister of the Interior at some points.
Mm-hmm.
And here is someone who was raised under all of that cumulative oppression who stopped it.
Mm-hmm.
And that changed the attitude in the Indigenous communities. And that was in 87. And then the Oka crisis brought more people into a stronger voice for probably the most sacred aspect of their lives, which is a cemetery.
So Leslie, let's just, you were at Swan Lake, but as is true for many of us, life and ministry called you on. You left that community, put your research on hold. But as we said at the beginning of our conversation, retirement gave you the opportunity to come back to this research. So what was that like? How did you shift gears? How did you get back into the work, especially when you think about how technology had changed, the world had changed? What did it take for you to pick up this research again?
I had been able to do a little bit every now and then in the intervening years. But Roy McKinney had died, and I felt he had put this trust in me to write this history, and I felt really badly that he didn't see anything other than really bad preliminary report, and I wanted to finish it. So it was easy to get into it that way. But when I started, I didn't have a computer. All my archival research was done at the archives or in the library with the microfiche or the microfilm.
Many of us remember this, but we are talking about a very different technology.
We are, and my notes were handwritten. You know, very. And anyway, so by the time I got back to it, I had a computer, and so much more was online. I would not have been able to gather as much information if I'd had to go from archive to archive. And I could access things like the Métis family records, and because the second missionary teacher was an Anglican Métis. And and then small little communities, like the village of Manitou in southern Manitoba, had their own historical archive, which I could access. There's this marvelous website called thefadedpage.org, where books that are now in public domain can be accessed, saved, downloaded and saved.
Mm-hmm.
And I found several that were written by people who had known Yellow Quill's band, which became Swan Lake, as young people and wrote books. So there were some eyewitness accounts. But one important thing I failed to mention earlier, when I was working at Swan Lake, I was able to talk to a lot of people who had attended the day school or gone to residential school. And while they didn't say very much, sometimes I'm not sure why, but part of it is don't speak ill of the dead, and part of it is I don't want to talk about that, and part of it is can't remember. It was a long time ago. I'm now in my 70s, you know, and I can't remember what happened when I was 6. But and I was through using the internet, I was able to find some of the ministers in the surrounding area who were still alive and I could talk to. How did the people in Pilot Mound react to the students then going to that school? What was the minister's involvement? I could access lots of Presbyterian conference records that were now online. So it made it a lot easier, and less expensive.
And you were able to finally complete your research. And what's happened to that research? Have you shared it with the people of Swan Lake? And what about folks in the United Church in Manitoba and the wider church?
Yeah, Swan Lake Chief and Council have received electronic copies, I think, of the third draft and then of the final. And then I sent them a hard copy of the final document, which is about 140 pages, not counting footnotes and bibliography and glossary and I have pages and pages of people who are mentioned in the document who I've had to identify, because who would know who Chief Bone was anymore, you know? Mm-hmm. And then most recently, I just gathered up all of my research notes and other documents that I may not have used, but I had as background, and sent them to their researcher now, David Scott, who is looking at the day school program, and he's writing his own book of some sort.
So many of us in the United Church are realizing what we don't know. Well, how can you ever know what you don't know? We're realizing there's much we don't know. We're hungry to learn. So many groups are going to YouTube, are reading various books. We recognize that there's a fuller history that we're being called by Indigenous people, by our denomination, by God. We are being called to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to this fuller history. As somebody who has been immersed in a piece of it, what do you say? Do you have anything you want to say to others of us in the United Church who are far behind you in terms of realizing more of what went on, and would really benefit from the research you've done? Just in a sentence or two, what would you say to us?
Seldom even ask for a meal at a restaurant in one sentence. Um, the what astounded me when I was putting this together and trying to summarize it was that even with my awareness of racism, my awareness of the residential schools, of the Indian Act, of the suppression of Indigenous religion, which also included the suppression of the Indigenous ministers in the early 1900s, Christian ministers. For the most part, everybody involved had good intentions, but the road to hell is paved for the intended upon. And at the beginning of our conversation today, I mentioned the embeddedness of colonialism, which goes way beyond racism and is in the lives and the living and the work of good people. It is still a tool of genocide. And that is not only a major challenge to our understanding of our good works as a church, or the history of the church, and the niceness of Canada, it's a major challenge to our faith. And things are not going to get any better in a fundamental way until we deal with that.
Leslie.
Yes.
Spoken like an historian, spoken like a prophet, you leave us with much to think about. Thank you so very much, Leslie.
Thank you.